The morning sun cast long shadows across the barren expanse of Red Mesa territory as Mara Yates knelt beside the shallow creek, her weathered hands cupping the precious water to her lips. The liquid was cool against her parched throat, a momentary relief from the constant thirst that had become her companion during 6 months of exile. Each drop was treasured, each sip a small victory against the harsh desert that had become both her prison and her sanctuary. The creek was barely 3 feet wide at its widest point, fed by an underground spring that bubbled up from the rocky depth somewhere in the hills above. During the dry season, it was the only reliable source of water for miles around, which was why Mara had chosen to build their shelter nearby. The abandoned shack that served as their home sat 30 yards away, its rotting timbers and sagging roof a testament to their desperate circumstances. "Mama, I'm so hungry it hurts," Elsie whispered, her small voice barely audible above the gentle trickle of water over stones. At 8 years old, she had learned to keep her complaints quiet. Sound carried far in the desert, and strangers meant danger. Her once plump cheeks were now hollow, her bright blue eyes sunken in a face that had seen too much hardship for one so young. "I know, my brave girl," Mara replied, her voice hoarse from the constant dust and dry air. She reached out to stroke her daughter's tangled blonde hair, feeling the brittle texture that spoke of malnutrition and neglect. "We'll check the rabbit snares first thing, then look for those prickly pear fruits we saw yesterday near the big boulder." She didn't mention that the snares had been empty for 4 days straight, their last catch a scrawny jackrabbit that had provided barely enough meat for one meal. She also didn't mention that the prickly pear fruits were still weeks from ripening, their green flesh hard and bitter. Hope was all they had left, and she refused to let it die in her daughter's eyes. The thought that haunted her every waking moment crept back into her mind like a persistent shadow. What if I can't keep her alive? What if I'm not strong enough, smart enough to protect my little girl? The fear was a constant companion, as present as the ache in her empty stomach and the burning sensation in her sun-damaged skin. She had lost weight steadily over the past months, her once full figure now gaunt and angular. Her brown hair, once lustrous and well-kept, now hung in tangled strands around her face, streaked with premature gray from stress and hardship. At 32 years old, Mara felt ancient. The woman who had once been the respected wife of Red Mesa's sheriff seemed like a stranger from another lifetime. That woman had worn clean dresses and attended church socials, had worried about mundane things like what to serve for Sunday dinner and whether the garden would produce enough vegetables for the winter. This woman, this exile, worried about finding enough food to last another day and whether the thin walls of their shelter would hold against the next storm. As they walked back toward the shack, Mara's trained eye swept the landscape for any sign of danger. Life in the wilderness had sharpened her senses, made her acutely aware of every sound, every movement, every disturbance in the natural order. It was this heightened awareness that made her freeze when she noticed something that chilled her blood. Fresh hoof prints in the dirt near their door, at least 3 horses, maybe more. The prints were recent, made within the last few hours, judging by the sharp edges and lack of wind erosion. Her heart began to race as she realized they were being watched, had probably been watched for some time. "Elsie, get behind me," she whispered, but even as she spoke, she saw them. 3 masked figures emerged from behind the scattered boulders that dotted the landscape like the bones of some ancient giant. They moved with the confidence of men who had done this before, their faces hidden behind dusty bandanas, each carrying a bow with arrows nocked and ready. The leader, a tall man with cruel eyes visible above his mask, stepped forward with deliberate confidence. The morning light glinted off the metal points of their arrows, and Mara could see that each man carried additional weapons, knives at their belts, rope coiled around their shoulders, and the bulge of concealed pistols beneath their dust-covered coats. These weren't common thieves or desperate drifters. They were professional killers, men who had been paid to do a job and intended to do it thoroughly. "Well, well," the leader called out, his voice rough and mocking. "Look what we found, boys. The witch and her spawn, just like Mr. Creed said we would." Mara's blood turned to ice at the mention of that name. Creed. Amos Creed, the cattle baron, who controlled most of the territory around Red Mesa with an iron fist and a network of corrupt officials. His brother had died in a gunfight with her husband Thomas 2 years ago, a justified shooting that had been ruled legal by the territorial judge after a thorough investigation. But she knew Creed had never accepted that verdict, had never forgiven the man who had killed his only remaining family. "We haven't done anything wrong," Mara said, backing toward the shack while keeping Elsie behind her. Her voice was steady despite the terror that was clawing at her chest, a mother's instinct overriding her own fear. "We just want to be left alone. Should have thought of that before you stole from honest folks," the leader replied, and now Mara recognized his voice. Jake Morrison, a drifter who had been run out of Red Mesa the previous year for cattle rustling. She had testified against him at his trial back when her words still meant something in town. Back when people believed she was an honest woman instead of a thief and a murderer. The second man, shorter and stockier than Morrison, laughed as he raised his bow. "Especially thieves who consort with witch doctors and poison good Christian men. My husband died of fever," Mara said desperately, still backing toward the shack. The lie came easily, now repeated so many times that it felt like truth. "The whole town knows that. Doc Henderson examined him himself. The whole town knows you killed him for his money." Morrison sneered, his arrow now trained directly on her chest. "Just like they know you stole from the town fund after he was gone. But don't worry, we're here to make sure you don't steal from anyone else." The third man, who had remained silent until now, spoke up in a voice like grinding gravel. "Boss wants it to look like Indians did it. Arrows make it cleaner, harder to trace back to civilized folk." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. Apache raiding party, maybe. Been plenty of them through here lately." Mara's mind raced as she processed what she was hearing. This wasn't a random attack by desperate men. This was an execution carefully planned and orchestrated by someone with the resources and influence to make it look like something else entirely. Creed wasn't just seeking revenge. He was eliminating witnesses, tying up loose ends that might someday threaten his empire. "Please," she said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to remain calm. "If you want me dead, kill me. But let my daughter go. She's just a child, she doesn't know anything." "Child grows up to be a woman," the third man observed coldly. "Women talk, women remember. Better to end it now, clean and simple." The first arrow struck without warning. Mara had just reached the shack's doorway when she heard the bowstring's sharp twang, a sound like a guitar string snapping under too much tension. The iron-tipped shaft punched through the thin wooden wall beside her head, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. The arrowhead was designed for hunting large game, she realized with horror, designed to cause maximum damage to flesh and bone. But even as she dove through the doorway, pulling Elsie with her, she could see Morrison knocking another arrow. His movements were smooth and practiced the actions of a man who had killed before and felt no remorse about doing it again. This arrow was aimed directly at her daughter. Time seemed to slow as Mara watched the deadly projectile cut through the air. She could see every detail with crystalline clarity: the gray goose feathers of the fletching, the iron point that had been filed to a razor sharpness, the slight wobble in the shaft that spoke of hurried craftsmanship. But most clearly of all, she could see where it was heading, straight toward Elsie's small chest, toward the heart that beat with such innocent trust. Elsie's wide eyes, filled with terror and confusion, looked up at her mother with absolute faith. "She believes I can protect her," Mara thought with a mixture of fierce pride and desperate fear. "She believes I'm strong enough to keep her safe even against this." The protective instinct that had kept her alive through 6 months of exile flared to life with primal intensity. Mara threw herself across the cramped interior of the shack, her body colliding with Elsie's, just as the arrow found its mark. The iron point punched through her shoulder blade and emerged from her collarbone, the impact sending both mother and daughter crashing to the rough wooden floor. The pain was unlike anything Mara had ever experienced. It wasn't just the physical agony of torn flesh and shattered bone, though that was considerable, but the burning, spreading sensation that seemed to radiate outward from the wound like liquid fire. She could feel her life force ebbing with each heartbeat, warm blood pooling beneath her body where she lay in the dust and debris. But even as she gasped in pain, she felt a fierce satisfaction. Elsie was alive. That was all that mattered. "Mama." Elsie screamed, her small hands pressing against the growing stain of crimson on her mother's dress. You're bleeding so much." "I'm all right, sweetheart." Mara lied, though she could feel her strength ebbing with each heartbeat. The arrow had struck bone. She could feel the grinding sensation whenever she tried to move, could sense the damage that went far beyond what the eye could see. "Just stay close to me. Don't move away from me." Outside, Morrison's laughter echoed across the desert like the howl of a coyote. "Good shot, boys," winged the mother, "make her suffer a bit. Then we finish them both nice and slow." Boss said to make it look like Indians. The third man reminded him. Indians would have killed them quick. Indians also would have taken scalps and burned the place. Morrison replied. "We'll get to that. But first I want to hear them beg." But as he spoke, another sound cut through the morning air, the sharp crack of a rifle shot that echoed off the canyon walls and sent birds scattering from their roosts. Morrison's confident swagger vanished as he dove for cover behind a boulder, his hand clutching his right wrist where a bullet had shattered 2 fingers. "Son of a bitch," he screamed, his bow clattering to the ground. "Where'd that come from?" The answer came in the form of a second shot that kicked up dirt at his feet, followed by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. A lone rider was charging toward them from the western ridge, his rifle smoking in his hands, and his face set in grim determination. "Back off or the next one goes through your skull," the stranger shouted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to do so again. As the rider drew closer, Mara caught a glimpse of his face beneath the brim of his weathered hat. Something about him seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. He was tall and lean, with the sun-weathered features of someone who had spent years in the saddle. His clothes were dusty and travel-worn, his boots scuffed from countless miles of hard riding. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, sharp, alert, and filled with what looked like recognition as he looked at her. There was something else in his expression, too. Something that went beyond mere concern for strangers in distress. It was the look of a man who had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it, dreading it, but knowing it was inevitable. Morrison and his companions dove for cover behind the scattered rocks, their confident assault suddenly transformed into a desperate scramble for survival. The stranger's horse, a powerful bay gelding with the deep chest and strong legs of a cavalry mount, covered the distance to the shack in seconds, its rider dismounting even before the animal had come to a complete stop. "Well, ma'am, are you hurt?" He called out, his eyes scanning the area for threats, while his hands worked to reload his rifle. There was something in his voice, a note of concern that seemed to go beyond mere chivalry. It was the voice of a man who knew her, who had perhaps been watching from afar and waiting for this moment. "I'm shot," Mara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Arrow through the shoulder. But my daughter's unhurt." The stranger approached the shack cautiously, his rifle held ready. Every movement spoke of military training, of a man who had learned to fight in situations where a single mistake could mean death. His eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning for threats, calculating angles and distances. "My name's Reed Carter," he said, kneeling beside her to examine the wound. His hands were gentle but skilled, moving with the confidence of someone who had treated battlefield injuries before. "And I'm going to get you and your daughter out of here safely." "Why?" Mara asked, studying his face for any sign of deception. In her months of exile, she had learned to trust no one, to question every kindness and suspect every stranger. Why would you help complete strangers? Reed's hands paused in their work, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or the weight of an old promise. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion he was trying to conceal. "Because I made a vow to an old friend," he said quietly. "And I intend to keep it, no matter the cost." Another arrow whistled through the air, embedding itself in the doorframe inches from Reed's head. The iron point quivered with the force of impact, its presence a stark reminder of the danger they still faced. Reed spun toward the sound, his rifle tracking the movement with practiced precision, and fired. The shot echoed across the desert, followed by a scream of pain from behind the rocks. "Can you walk?" Reed asked, helping Mara to her feet. His arm was strong around her waist, supporting her weight as she struggled to stand. "I think so," she replied, though her legs felt weak and unsteady. The arrow wound sent fresh jolts of agony through her shoulder with every movement, and she could feel warm blood seeping through her dress. But the alternative, staying here and waiting for Morrison to regroup, was certain death. "Then we need to move, now." Reed scooped Elsie up in his left arm while supporting Mara with his right. The journey to his horse felt like an eternity, with arrows falling around them like deadly rain. Each step was a struggle against pain and weakness, each breath of victory against the darkness that threatened to claim her consciousness. But somehow they made it, and Reed boosted both of them onto the bay's broad back before swinging up behind them. The horse was well trained, responding to subtle pressure from Reed's knees rather than the reins leaving his hands free to handle his rifle. "Hold on tight," he commanded, spurring the horse into a gallop. "We're going to ride hard and fast." They rode toward the east, following a narrow canyon that cut through the rocky hills like a giant's knife stroke. The canyon walls rose on either side of them, their red sandstone faces carved by wind and rain into fantastic shapes that seemed to watch their flight with ancient eyes. Behind them, Mara could hear the sound of pursuit hoofbeats and angry voices growing closer with each passing minute. "There's a cave about a mile ahead," Reed shouted over the wind. "We can take shelter there until—" His words were cut off by a rifle shot that sent chips of rock flying from the canyon wall beside them. Morrison and his men had found their horses and were giving chase their weapons now, including firearms as well as bows. The advantage of surprise was gone, replaced by a running battle through terrain that favored the pursuers. "They're gaining on us." Mara gasped, her consciousness fading from blood loss and pain. The rhythmic pounding of the horse's hooves seemed to merge with the beating of her heart, both growing weaker with each passing moment. "Not if I can help it," Reed replied grimly, guiding the horse toward a narrow side canyon. The passage was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, its entrance almost hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines and twisted juniper trees. The walls closed in around them, creating a natural tunnel that offered concealment from their pursuers. As they entered the shadowy defile, Reed slowed the horse to a walk. "This leads to an underground stream," he explained, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "We can follow it to an old line shack where we can make a stand." The cave entrance appeared around a bend in the passage, its mouth yawning like a hungry maw in the rock face. The opening was large enough for a horse and rider, but the interior was lost in shadow. Reed dismounted and helped Mara and Elsie down from the horse, then led them inside. The interior was cool and dark, a welcome relief from the burning heat of the desert sun. The sound of running water echoed from somewhere deeper in the cave, and the air carried the mineral scent of limestone and ancient stone. Reed quickly gathered some dry wood from a pile near the entrance and built a small fire, its light casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. "How did you know about this place?" Mara asked, settling onto a flat rock with Elsie beside her. The child had been remarkably quiet throughout their flight, but now she clung to her mother, with desperate intensity. "I've been tracking Morrison and his men for weeks," Reed replied, tearing strips from his shirt to make fresh bandages. "I knew this day would come, knew that Creed would eventually make his move against you. You've been tracking them." Mara's voice rose with a mixture of hope and anger. "Then you know why they're trying to kill us." Reed's face darkened as he worked on her wound. "I know more than that," he said quietly. "I know who really killed your husband." The words hit Mara like a physical blow. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what she had just heard. "Thomas died of fever," she said automatically, though her voice lacked conviction. "The doctor said—" "The doctor lied." Reed interrupted, his voice harsh with suppressed emotion. "Or maybe he was just fooled by a very clever killer. But I know the truth, and I can prove it. You're saying Thomas was murdered." Mara's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 2 years of grief and confusion. "I'm saying Thomas was poisoned," Reed replied bluntly. "Slowly, carefully, over the course of several weeks. And I know who did it." Before Mara could respond, the sound of approaching voices echoed from the cave entrance. Morrison and his men had found their hiding place, their torches casting flickering light on the stone walls. "Come out, witch!" Morrison's voice boomed through the cave. "You're just making this harder on yourself and the girl." Reed quickly extinguished the fire and positioned himself near the entrance, his rifle ready. "Stay quiet," he whispered to Mara and Elsie. "And stay back." The next few minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the sound of the underground stream and the occasional scrape of boots on stone. Morrison's men were searching the cave system, but they were moving cautiously, unsure of what they might find in the darkness. "I can smell smoke," one of them said. "They're in here somewhere." "Split up," Morrison ordered. "Check every passage, every chamber. They can't have gone far." Reed led Mara and Elsie deeper into the cave, following the sound of running water. The passage narrowed and widened unpredictably, sometimes forcing them to crawl on hands and knees, other times opening into vast chambers that seemed to stretch away into infinity. "Where are we going?" Mara whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the darkness. "There's another entrance about half a mile ahead," Reed replied. "It opens near the old line shack I mentioned. We can make a stand there." The journey through the underground stream was treacherous, with slippery rocks and sudden drops that threatened to send them tumbling into the churning water. But Reed guided them expertly, his knowledge of the cave system proving invaluable. He moved with the confidence of someone who had explored these passages before, who had perhaps used them as a hiding place during his own years of exile. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they saw light ahead, natural sunlight filtering through another cave entrance. Reed helped Mara and Elsie climb out of the water and up the rocky slope toward the opening. When they finally emerged from the cave, the sun was already beginning to sink toward the western horizon. The line shack sat in a small depression between 2 rocky ridges, its walls built from native stone, and its roof constructed of thick pine logs. It was a fortress in miniature designed to withstand Apache raids and outlaw attacks. "This will do," Reed said, helping Mara and Elsie down from the cave entrance. "It's defensible, and there's only one way in." As they approached the shack, Mara noticed that Reed was moving with a slight limp. "Are you hurt?" she asked, though her own pain made it difficult to focus on anything else. "Just a graze," he replied, though she could see blood seeping through his pants leg. "Nothing serious." The interior of the line shack was sparse but functional. A stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and a few pieces of furniture left behind by previous occupants. Most importantly, it had thick walls, and only one door, making it defensible against the kind of attack they were facing. Reed immediately began barricading the door with a table and chairs, creating a makeshift fortification. As he worked, he glanced frequently at Mara, that look of recognition still flickering in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said finally, setting down a heavy wooden chest to reinforce the barricade. "I need to ask you something. What was your name before you married Thomas Yates?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, and Mara hesitated before answering. In her months of exile, she had learned to be cautious about revealing personal information even to those who seemed friendly. "Sullivan. Mary Catherine Sullivan. Why do you ask?" Reed's face went pale, and he reached into his coat pocket with trembling fingers. He withdrew a sealed envelope, its edges worn and yellowed with age. The paper was military issue, and the wax seal bore the impression of a cavalry regiment. "Because your husband gave me this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 2 years ago, 3 days before he died. He made me promise to deliver it to you when the time was right. Mara's heart stopped. The envelope was addressed in Thomas's careful handwriting. "For my beloved wife, Mary Catherine, to be delivered only by Reed Carter, and only when it is safe to do so." Thomas knew he was going to die. Reed continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "He knew who was going to kill him, and he knew why. He asked me to watch over you and Elsie to keep you safe until justice could be served. You've been watching us," Mara said, her voice rising with anger that was mixed with desperate hope. "All this time you've been out there somewhere, and you let us suffer. I wanted to help sooner." Reed replied, his face crumpling with guilt. "Every day for the past 6 months, I wanted to ride up to that shack and tell you the truth. But Thomas made me promise to keep you safe first and seek justice second. If I had approached you directly, Creed would have killed you both immediately. So you watched us starve," Mara said bitterly. "You watched my daughter forget what it was like to have a real home, to feel safe and loved. I watched over you." Reed corrected, his voice firm despite the pain in his eyes. "I've been camped 5 miles from here, close enough to intervene if necessary. I've been hunting Creed's men, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike." "And when was that going to be?" Mara demanded, her voice breaking with exhaustion and grief. "When we died of starvation, when Elsie forgot what her father looked like. When I could guarantee your safety," Reed said. "When I had enough evidence to destroy Creed completely, to make sure he could never hurt you again. 2 years. Mara whispered, the full weight of her suffering suddenly crashing down on her. 2 years of believing I was alone, that everyone I trusted had turned against me. "You were never alone," Reed said quietly. "Thomas made sure of that. He made me promise to protect you no matter what it cost me personally." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Reed peered through a gap in the barricade and cursed under his breath. "They're back," he said, "and they've brought more men." Through the gap, Mara could see at least 6 mounted figures approaching the line shack. At their head rode a figure she recognized all too well. Amos Creed himself, the cattle baron who had destroyed her family. He was a large man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of presence that commanded attention wherever he went. Reed Carter. Creed's voice boomed across the desert. "I should have killed you years ago, you yellow-bellied deserter. Come out and face me like a man." "I'm not going anywhere," Reed called back, checking his rifle. "But I've got something that belongs to you." "And what might that be?" "The truth," Reed replied, holding up Thomas's letter. "The whole truth about what you did to Sheriff Yates." Even from a distance, Mara could see Creed's face darken with rage. "You don't know what you're talking about, Carter. Thomas Yates died of fever just like everyone else knows. He died of strychnine poisoning," Reed shot back. "Administered over a period of weeks by someone who wanted his death to look natural, and I can prove it." With shaking hands, Mara broke the seal on Thomas's letter and unfolded it. The paper was brittle with age, but the words were still clear, written in her husband's careful handwriting. My dearest Mary Catherine, if you are reading this, then I am dead, and Reed Carter has judged it safe to deliver this message. I pray that you and Elsie are well, and that you have found some measure of peace despite what has happened. I am being murdered. I have been feeling ill for weeks now, and yesterday I found white powder in my coffee, the same bitter residue I have tasted every morning for the past month. I have saved a sample in the cloth pouch attached to this letter, and I believe it to be strychnine or something similar. The man responsible is Amos Creed. He has been seeking revenge for his brother's death, and he has chosen this method because it cannot be traced back to him. He has already prepared false evidence of embezzlement to destroy your reputation after I am gone, and he has bribed Mayor Caldwell and several other officials to look the other way. I have shared this information with Reed Carter, who served under me during the Apache campaigns. He is a good man, but he has been forced to live as a wanted man because of false charges brought against him by Creed's influence. I have asked him to watch over you from a distance, and to deliver this letter only when he can protect you from Creed's retaliation. I am sorry, my love. Sorry that I failed to protect you from this fate, and sorry that I will not be there to see our daughter grow up. But I have faith that Reed will do what I can't. He will see that justice is done, and that you are both safe. The powder sample is sewn into the lining of my dress uniform jacket, which hangs in our bedroom closet. It should be enough to convict my killer if you can find an honest judge to hear the case. I have also hidden additional evidence in the false bottom of my desk drawer. Letters from Creed threatening me, documentation of his brother's crimes, and testimony from witnesses who saw him meeting with known criminals. Use it wisely. All my love, Thomas. P.S. Trust Reed Carter with your life. He is the only man I know who will keep his word, no matter what it costs him. Mara's hands shook as she finished reading, tears streaming down her face. Inside the envelope was a small cloth pouch containing white crystalline powder, the evidence that could clear her name and convict her husband's killer. You knew, she whispered, looking up at Reed with a mixture of grief and fury. You knew all along that Thomas was murdered, and you did nothing. I did everything I could. Reed replied, his own voice thick with emotion. But I couldn't risk your life by moving too quickly. Creed had too many allies, too much influence. If I had approached you directly, he would have killed you both immediately. So you let us live like animals while you sat on evidence that could have cleared my name. I let you live, Reed said firmly. That was my promise to Thomas, to keep you and Elsie alive no matter what. Everything else was secondary. Secondary. Mara's voice rose to almost a shout. My reputation, my standing in the community, my daughter's future, all of that was secondary. Yes, Reed said without hesitation. Your lives were more important than your reputations. Thomas knew that. He made me promise to keep you safe first and worry about justice later. Outside, Creed's voice rose again, filled with impatience and growing anger. Whatever you think you know, Carter, it won't matter. I own half the judges in this territory. I've got enough money to buy my way out of any courtroom. Maybe, Reed called back. But first you have to live long enough to see one. The response was immediate and devastating. Creed's men opened fire with rifles, their bullets striking the stone walls of the shack with deafening crashes. Reed dove away from the door as splinters of wood and stone flew through the air like shrapnel. Get down, he shouted, pulling Mara and Elsie behind the stone fireplace. The gunfire continued for several minutes, a constant barrage that made conversation impossible. The sound was deafening in the confined space, and the air filled with dust and smoke from the impact. When it finally stopped, Reed cautiously peered around the edge of the fireplace. They're moving into position, he reported. surrounding the shack. Mara looked around the interior of the shack, her mind racing despite the pain from her wound. The walls were thick stone, but the roof was made of wood and could be burned. The door was solid oak, but it wouldn't hold forever against a determined assault. And they had only one rifle against at least 6 men. "How much ammunition do you have?" she asked. 12 rounds. Reed replied, checking his cartridge belt. "Not enough for a prolonged fight." "Then we need to be smart about this," Mara said, her voice growing stronger despite her injuries. "We need to use what we have." She began examining the contents of the shack more carefully. There was a coil of rope in one corner left behind by previous occupants. A few metal tools hung from hooks on the wall, a pickaxe, a shovel, a pry bar. And most importantly, she could see through a crack in the wall that there was a pile of loose rocks on the ridge above them, rocks that looked precariously balanced. She said quietly, "I have an idea." Before he could respond, the sound of splintering wood echoed through the shack. Creed's men were attacking the door with axes, their heavy blows sending vibrations through the entire structure. The oak was thick and well seasoned, but it wouldn't hold indefinitely. "Whatever you're planning, do it fast," Reed said, positioning himself near the door with his rifle ready. The attack began in earnest at 4:30 in the afternoon, marked by the first axe blow against the oak door. Mara watched through the crack in the wall as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, knowing that each minute brought them closer to nightfall and the possibility of escape or death. 4:35 p.m. The second axe blow split the door's upper panel, sending splinters flying into the shack's interior. Reed fired his first shot through the gap, aiming not to kill, but to discourage the axe wielders. The shot struck the door frame near one of the attackers, and the axe work stopped abruptly. "One warning shot," Reed muttered, working the bolt on his rifle. 11 rounds left. "You're just delaying the inevitable, Carter." Creed's voice boomed from outside. "Give up now, and I'll make it quick for the woman and child." "Go to hell, Creed," Reed replied, his voice cold as winter steel. 4:40 p.m. The assault resumed with renewed fury. 2 men now worked on the door with axes, while others provided covering fire through the windows. The sound was deafening metal on wood, and the crash of rifle fire, the shouted orders of Creed's voice directing the attack. Mara had been studying the pile of rocks through the crack in the wall, calculating angles and distances. The coil of rope was in her hands now, and she had identified exactly what she needed to do. But first, she needed to get Reed's attention without alerting their attackers. "Reed," she whispered during a brief lull in the gunfire, "I need you to keep them busy for exactly 3 minutes. Can you do that?" "What are you planning?" he asked, though his eyes never left the door. "Trust me," Mara replied, already moving toward the back wall of the shack. 4:45 p.m. The door was half destroyed now, its lower panel completely gone. Reed fired his second shot, then his third, each one carefully aimed to discourage the axe wielders. But for every man he hit, another seemed to take his place. The acrid smell of gunpowder began to fill the shack, mixing with the dust and splinters to create a choking haze. Mara's wounded shoulder throbbed with each rifle shot, and the recoil vibrating through the stone walls and sending fresh waves of agony through her body. She had found a small gap in the back wall barely wide enough for the rope. Working quickly despite the pain, she threaded the rope through the gap and began to tie knots at specific intervals. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency. Years of mending nets and rigging clotheslines had taught her to work with rope even under pressure. 4:50 p.m. 8 rounds left. Reed reported, his voice tight with concentration. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the coolness of the evening air. A stray bullet had grazed his left temple, leaving a thin line of blood that trickled down his cheek. Mara had finished with the rope and was now working on the second part of her plan. She had noticed that one of the metal tools on the wall was a pry bar perfect for what she needed to do. But first, she needed to create a fulcrum point. "Elsie," she whispered to her daughter, who had been huddled silently in the corner throughout the siege. "I need you to be very brave for Mama. Can you do that?" The 8-year-old nodded, her blue eyes wide with fear but trusting. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to help me move this chest," Mara said, indicating a heavy wooden box that had been serving as a seat. "We need to put it against the back wall right under that crack." 4:52 p.m. Reed opened fire with rapid controlled shots, forcing Creed's men to take cover. The sound of his rifle was almost continuous now, each shot buying Mara precious seconds to work. She could hear him counting under his breath. 6, 5, 4. Working together, Mara and Elsie managed to push the chest against the back wall. It was heavy, filled with old tools and supplies, but it provided exactly the stable platform Mara needed. She climbed onto it, ignoring the fresh surge of pain from her arrow wound. 4:54 p.m. 3 rounds left. Reed announced, his voice strained. The door was nearly destroyed now, hanging on its hinges by just a few stubborn pieces of wood. "Whatever you're doing, do it now." Mara had threaded the rope through the gap and was now working on the crucial connection. The other end of the rope ran across the rocky slope to the pile of loose boulders she had identified. But she needed something to trigger the release at exactly the right moment. 4:56 p.m. The door finally gave way, completely, its remnants crashing inward. Reed fired his last 3 rounds in rapid succession, dropping one attacker, but leaving himself defenseless as the others rushed forward. "Now!" Mara shouted, pulling hard on the rope she had rigged. The rope ran through the gap in the wall, across the rocky slope, and around the base of the largest boulder in the pile above them. When Mara pulled with all her remaining strength, the carefully balanced rock shifted, then began to roll. The physics of the avalanche were simple but devastating. The largest boulder, weighing perhaps 1,000 pounds, dislodged several smaller rocks as it began to move. These in turn knocked loose others, creating a cascading effect that quickly grew beyond control. 4:58 p.m. The rumbling began as a low vibration that could be felt through the ground, then grew to a thunderous roar that drowned out even the sound of gunfire. Creed, who had been directing the assault from horseback directly below the ridge, suddenly looked up to see a wall of stone thundering down toward him. His horse, a magnificent black stallion that had carried him through countless battles, reared in terror and tried to bolt. But there was nowhere to run, and the avalanche covered too wide, an area moved too fast for even the swiftest horse to escape. "Boss!" Morrison screamed from his position near the shack, but his warning came too late. The largest boulder struck Creed's horse, first crushing the animal instantly and throwing its rider from the saddle directly into the path of the falling debris. 4:59 p.m. Creed's scream was cut short as a boulder the size of a whiskey barrel crashed down on his legs, pinning him to the ground. The impact was followed by a shower of smaller rocks that buried him up to his waist, trapping him completely. The avalanche lasted only seconds, but when it was over, the landscape had been transformed. Where once there had been a gently sloping ridge, there was now a field of scattered boulders and debris. 3 of Creed's men lay buried beneath the rubble, their bodies crushed by the weight of the falling stone. 5:00 p.m. Silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by Creed's groans of pain and the distant sound of retreating hoofbeats. The remaining attackers, shocked by the sudden reversal of fortune, had fled toward their horses. But Reed wasn't finished. He had found Morrison's rifle among the wreckage near the door and was now armed again. The former cavalryman moved with deadly precision, his military training taking over as he pursued the fleeing gunman. His first shot brought down the man who had been wielding the second axe. The bullet caught him in the back as he ran, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the dust. His second shot wounded another attacker, sending him stumbling behind a boulder with blood streaming from his shoulder. "Give up," Reed called out, his voice carrying clearly across the desert. "Your boss is finished, and you're outnumbered." "Go to hell," came the reply from behind the boulder, followed by a wild shot that went wide. Reed began to work his way around the rocks, using the terrain to his advantage. He had fought Apaches in country like this during his cavalry days, had learned to move silently and strike without warning. The wounded gunman never saw him coming. The final shot echoed off the canyon walls, and then silence fell over the battlefield. Reed stood among the bodies of his enemies, his rifle smoking in his hands, justice finally served after years of exile and frustration. But even as he surveyed the destruction, he could hear Creed's voice calling out from beneath the boulder that had trapped him. The cattle baron was still alive, though clearly in agony. "You think you've won?" Creed snarled, spitting blood. "You think that letter means anything? I own half the judges in this territory. I've got enough money to buy my way out of any courtroom." Reed walked over to where Creed lay, pinned, his rifle held ready. The cattle baron's legs were clearly broken, probably shattered beyond repair. But his eyes still blazed with the same hatred and arrogance that had driven him to murder. "Maybe," Reed said quietly. "But first you have to survive long enough to see a courtroom." "You wouldn't kill an unarmed man," Creed said, though his voice held uncertainty. "I wouldn't," Reed agreed. "But I'm not the only one here with a score to settle." Mara had made her way down from the line shack, Thomas's letter clutched in her good hand. She stood over Creed's broken body, looking down at the man who had destroyed her family and stolen 2 years of her life. "Please," Creed gasped, seeing something in her eyes that terrified him. "I was just trying to avenge my brother. You understand that, don't you? Family is everything." "Yes," Mara said quietly. "Family is everything. That's why you're going to pay for what you did to mine." She knelt beside the trapped man, her face inches from his. "You poisoned my husband. You framed me for theft. You drove me and my daughter into the wilderness to die. And now you're going to answer for all of it." "I'll give you money," Creed said desperately. "Enough to start a new life anywhere you want. Just let me go." "I don't want your money," Mara replied. "I want justice." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the desert. Reed spun toward the noise, his rifle raised, but relaxed when he saw the riders approaching from the west. "We're federal marshals," he said, recognizing the lead rider. Marshal Wilson and his deputies. The lawmen had been drawn by the sound of the avalanche and the prolonged gunfight, investigating reports of outlaw activity in the area. They arrived to find the battle already over, bodies scattered across the desert floor, and Amos Creed pinned beneath a boulder. "Well, I'll be damned," Marshal Wilson said, dismounting with his men. "Reed Carter, we've been looking for you for 5 years." "I've been looking for you too," Reed replied, lowering his rifle. "I've got evidence of murder, conspiracy, and fraud. Enough to clear my name and convict the man responsible." Wilson was a tall, lean man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades enforcing the law on the frontier. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing as he surveyed the scene before him. "This better be good," he said. "Because you're wanted for desertion, and that's a hanging offense." "It's better than good," Reed said, taking Thomas's letter from Mara. "It's the truth." As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Reed Carter told his story. He spoke of false accusations and corrupt officials, of murder disguised as natural death and evidence planted to frame the innocent. He showed the marshal Thomas's letter with its detailed account of the poisoning and the sample of strychnine that had been used. Mara added her own testimony describing the months of exile and the attack by Creed's hired killers. She spoke of the arrows that had been aimed at her daughter, of the avalanche that had brought down the man who had destroyed her family. Marshal Wilson listened in silence, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. When they had finished, he turned to Creed, who was still clinging to life despite his injuries. "Well, Amos," he said, "what do you have to say for yourself?" Creed's voice was barely a whisper. "It's all lies," he gasped. "Forgeries, fabrications. I'm a respected businessman, not a murderer." "Then you won't mind if we test that powder," Wilson said, taking the cloth pouch from Thomas's letter. "I've got a chemist in Tucson who can tell us exactly what it is." For the first time since his capture, Creed's defiance faltered. The bravado that had carried him through decades of criminal activity crumbled in the face of scientific evidence. "You can't prove anything with that," he said weakly. "We'll see," Wilson replied. "But combined with this letter and the testimony of these witnesses, I think we've got enough to hang you twice over." As the marshal's men worked to free Creed from beneath the boulder, the cattle baron made one last desperate attempt to escape justice. Despite his broken legs, he managed to draw a small pistol from his coat, a derringer he had kept hidden throughout the confrontation. "If I'm going to die," he snarled, raising the weapon toward Mara, "I'm taking you with me." But Reed was faster. His rifle shot took Creed in the chest, the impact spinning him around, sending the derringer flying from his grasp. The cattle baron collapsed beside the boulder that had trapped him, his breathing shallow and labored. "It's over," Reed said, lowering his rifle. "Finally, it's over." Creed's eyes found Mara's face one last time. You destroyed everything I built," he whispered. "You destroyed yourself," Mara replied. "I just helped justice find its way." The cattle baron's eyes closed and his breathing stopped. Amos Creed, who had terrorized the territory for decades, was dead. Marshal Wilson knelt beside the body, checking for a pulse. "He's gone," he announced. "But his death doesn't change the evidence. We've got enough here to expose the whole conspiracy." The journey back to Red Mesa took 2 days with the marshal's men escorting Reed and Mara, while a wagon carried the bodies of Creed and his men. Word of the cattle baron's death had spread quickly, and by the time they reached town, a crowd had gathered to witness their arrival. The reaction was mixed. Some townspeople cheered, grateful to be free of Creed's oppression. Others stood in shocked silence, unable to believe that the man who had controlled their lives for so long was finally gone. Mayor Caldwell, who had been in Creed's pocket for years, tried to maintain his innocence. But faced with the evidence in Thomas's letter and the testimony of the captured gunmen, he quickly confessed to his role in the conspiracy. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," he said, his voice breaking. "Creed said he just wanted to discredit Mara, not kill her husband." "You took bribes to falsify evidence," Marshal Wilson replied coldly. "That makes you an accessory to murder." The trials that followed were swift and decisive. With the physical evidence of the poison and the testimony of multiple witnesses, the remaining conspirators were quickly convicted. Some received prison sentences, others were hanged, and the entire network of corruption that had infected Red Mesa was dismantled. 3 months after the confrontation at the Line Shack, Reed Carter stood in the Red Mesa courthouse, watching as the last of Creed's associates were sentenced for their roles in the conspiracy. The cattle baron's empire had crumbled completely, his vast holdings seized by the territorial government and sold to pay restitution to his victims. Mara sat beside him in the gallery, wearing a simple blue dress that had been a gift from the townspeople, their way of apologizing for the years of exile and hardship she had endured. Her shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a thin scar as a reminder of the day that had changed everything. "Justice is served," she said quietly as the final verdict was read. "Yes," Reed agreed. "Finally, justice is served." They walked out of the courthouse together into the bright January sunshine. Red Mesa had changed dramatically. In the months since Creed's death, the corruption that had infected the town had been rooted out. Honest officials had been elected, and the atmosphere of fear that had characterized the Creed years had lifted like a morning fog. The townspeople who had once shunned Mara now went out of their way to make amends. Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife, had insisted on providing them with fresh bread every morning. The general store owner had extended unlimited credit. Even the preacher had asked Mara to consider returning to the church choir. "It's going to take time," Reed observed as they walked down Main Street, "for them to earn back your trust." "Time is something we have now," Mara replied. "Thanks to you." Reed had been officially pardoned by the territorial governor and offered his old rank back in the cavalry. But he had declined, choosing instead to accept the position of sheriff of Red Mesa, the same job that Thomas Yates had held before his murder. "Any regrets?" Mara asked as they approached the house that had once been the Yates family home. "None," Reed replied. "This is where I belong." The house had been restored to its former condition with the help of volunteers from the town. The furniture had been cleaned and repaired, the walls repainted, and the garden replanted. It was as if the years of abandonment had never happened. They had been married a month earlier in a simple ceremony at the Red Mesa Church. The entire town had attended their way of showing support for the woman they had wronged and the man who had brought justice to their community. Elsie had served as maid of honor, proudly carrying her mother's bouquet and calling Reed Papa from the moment the ceremony ended. The transformation in the little girl was remarkable. She had gained weight, her cheeks had filled out, and her eyes sparkled with the joy of a child who finally felt safe and loved. "Sheriff Carter," a voice called out from across the street. Deputy Morrison. A different Morrison than the gunman they had faced waved from the jailhouse. "There's a telegram for you from the territorial capital." Reed sighed and checked his pocket watch. The responsibilities of his new position were demanding, but he had embraced them with the same dedication he had once shown as a cavalry officer. "Duty calls," he said to Mara. "Will you and Elsie be all right getting home?" "We'll be fine," she replied, standing on her toes to kiss his cheek. "We'll see you for dinner." That evening, as the Carter family sat down to their meal, Reed looked around the table at his wife and daughter. The dining room was warm and inviting, lit by oil lamps and filled with the comfortable sounds of family life. The simple dinner of roast beef and vegetables had been prepared with love, and the conversation was filled with the easy rhythms of people who belonged together. "How was school today, Elsie?" Reed asked, cutting a piece of meat for her. "Good, Papa," she replied, her face bright with happiness. "Miss Henderson says I'm reading better than children 2 years older. She thinks I might be ready for advanced lessons." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Mara said, reaching across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. "Your father, Thomas, would be so proud of how smart you've become." Reed nodded, understanding that Thomas Yates would always be part of their family. The ghost of Mara's first husband was not a source of jealousy or resentment, but rather a reminder of the love and sacrifice that had brought them together. "Your father was a good man, Elsie," Reed said. "He stood up for what was right, even when it was dangerous. That's the kind of person I want you to grow up to be." "Like you did, Papa?" Elsie asked, her blue eyes serious. "I tried to," Reed replied. "But the most important thing is that we look out for each other. Family means we never give up on the people we love, no matter what." "Is that why you saved us from the bad men?" Elsie asked. "That's part of it," Reed said, glancing at Mara. "But I also saved you because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to protect the people they care about." "Will you teach me to make good choices?" Elsie asked. "Every day," Reed promised. "That's what fathers are for." As they finished their meal, Reed felt Mara's hand slip into his under the table. He looked at her, this woman who had survived exile and betrayal, who had protected her daughter with fierce determination, who had shown him what it meant to have a family worth fighting for. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "For what?" he asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "For keeping your promise. For saving us." for giving us a home again. Reed squeezed her hand gently. Thank you for letting me be part of your family, for giving me a reason to keep that promise. After dinner, as they prepared for bed, Reed helped Elsie with her nighttime prayers. She knelt beside her bed, her small hands folded, and spoke the words that had become her nightly ritual since they had returned to Red Mesa. Thank you, God, for bringing Papa Reed to us. Thank you for making us safe. Thank you for giving us a real home again. And please tell my first Papa that I love him and that I'm going to be brave like he was. As Reed tucked her into bed, Elsie looked up at him with the trusting eyes of a child who had finally found security. Papa Reed, she said softly. Yes, sweetheart. I'm glad you're my papa now. I know my first papa sent you to take care of us. Reed felt his throat tighten with emotion. I'm glad too, Elsie. And I promise I'll always take care of you and your mama. I know you will, she said simply, then closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep. Later, as Reed and Mara sat together on the porch of their home, watching the stars appear in the vast western sky, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Do you think Thomas would approve? Mara asked, her head resting on Reed's shoulder. I think he'd be happy that you and Elsie are safe and loved. Reed replied. That's all he ever wanted, for his family to be protected and cared for. And what about you? Are you happy? Reed looked out at the peaceful town of Red Mesa with its quiet streets and honest citizens. The saloon was still open, its windows glowing with warm light, but the violent men who had once frequented it were gone. The general store had a new owner, an honest man who gave fair prices and treated all customers with respect. Even the church had a new bell donated by grateful townspeople who wanted to celebrate their freedom from corruption. I'm more than happy, he said finally. I'm home. Do you ever miss your old life? The freedom of being on the road? Reed considered the question carefully. He had spent years as a wanderer, never staying in one place long enough to form lasting attachments. It had been a lonely existence, but it had also been simple, no responsibilities beyond his own survival. No one to disappoint or let down. Sometimes, he admitted, but not often. I've discovered that freedom isn't about having no ties, it's about choosing the ties that matter. And we matter to you. You matter more than anything, Reed said, pulling her closer. You and Elsie are my family now. You're what makes everything else worthwhile. As they sat in comfortable silence, a gentle breeze stirred the desert air, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant sound of a coyote's call. It was a peaceful sound, not the threatening howl of a predator, but the simple expression of a creature content with its place in the world. Oh, what do you think the future holds for us? Mara asked. I think we'll face whatever comes together, Reed replied. The three of us as a family, and I think we'll be stronger for it. Even if there are more challenges ahead, especially then, Reed said firmly. The hardest trials in life are the ones that show us who we really are. And I know who you are, Mara Carter. You're the strongest, most courageous woman I've ever known. I couldn't have survived without you, she said softly. Yes, you could have, Reed replied. You were surviving long before I came along. I just helped you find a way to stop running and start living again. As the night deepened and the stars grew brighter, Reed reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. Just a year ago, he had been a wanted man living in the wilderness, haunted by false accusations and driven by a promise to a dead friend. Now he was a respected member of the community, a husband and father, a man with roots and responsibilities. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, times when he wondered if he was truly capable of the domestic life he had chosen. But Mara and Elsie had shown him that strength came not from isolation, but from connection, not from running away, but from standing firm. "I love you," he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I love you too," Mara replied. "More than I thought possible after Thomas died. I didn't think I could ever feel this way again." "Thomas would want you to be happy," Reed said. "He would want Elsie to have a father who loved her and protected her. I think he'd be proud of the family we've built." "I hope so," Mara said. "I hope he knows that his sacrifice wasn't in vain, that his daughter is safe and loved." They remained on the porch for another hour, talking quietly about their hopes and plans for the future. Reed spoke of his desire to make Red Mesa a model community, a place where justice and fairness prevailed over corruption and violence. Mara shared her dreams of giving Elsie the education and opportunities she deserved, of watching her grow into a strong, independent woman. When they finally went inside, Reed made his nightly rounds, checking the doors and windows out of habit rather than necessity. Red Mesa was a safe place now, but old habits died hard. As he extinguished the lamps and prepared for bed, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to serve his community and protect his family. But tonight, he was content to lie beside his wife and listen to the gentle breathing of his sleeping daughter in the next room. The story of Reed Carter, the exiled cavalry officer who had found redemption in keeping a promise to a dead friend, was complete. But the story of the Carter family of love, triumphant over hatred, of justice, prevailing over corruption, of hope, conquering despair, was just beginning. In the quiet desert town of Red Mesa, where the wind whispered through the sage and the stars shone bright in the endless sky, 3 people had found something precious and rare. They had found each other, and in doing so had discovered that the greatest treasures in life were not gold or silver or land, but the unbreakable bonds of family and the courage to defend what mattered most. The harsh landscape of the American frontier had tested them, shaped them, and ultimately revealed their true strength. They had survived exile and betrayal, violence and loss, false accusations, and mortal danger. They had faced the worst that life could offer and emerged victorious, not because they were perfect, but because they had refused to give up on each other. And as the desert wind carried their story across the vast expanse of the Western Territories, it served as a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could light the way home. Even in the most lawless places, justice could prevail. And even in the harshest conditions, love could bloom and flourish like a desert flower after rain. The Carter family slept peacefully that night, secure in the knowledge that they had found their place in the world and would never be separated again. Their story was one of triumph over adversity, of love, conquering hate of ordinary people, doing extraordinary things when faced with impossible odds. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the desert and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they would wake to face a new day together, ready for whatever challenges and opportunities it might bring. For they had learned the most important lesson of all, that home is not a place, but the people who love you and stand by you no matter what.